disturbing experiences of night hikes in forests. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine while walking alone through the forest at night? The wind whispering through the trees, the unknown sounds around you, and the darkness, so deep it feels like it's swallowing you whole. It's in that moment that true fear settles in. But is it just your mind playing tricks? Or is there something lurking in the shadows? Why does the fear of the dark paralyze us? What happens when nature, which should be a refuge, turns into a labyrinth of mystery and tension? Today, you will hear real stories of people who dared to face the night in desolate forests and came away with experiences they will never forget. So, stay until the end and get ready to feel the adrenaline of those who have lived true terror. Would you be ready for a night like that? Story 1. Unexplained Encounter. It was a moonless night, and Marcos, an avid night hiker, decided to venture onto a trail he had walked many times during the day. The dense forest felt different under the darkness. The trees, once so familiar, now cast unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. He enjoyed the adrenaline that the unknown provided. But that night, something felt off. A sense of discomfort began to grow as he moved deeper into the trail. With only a flashlight illuminating the narrow path, Marcos walked carefully, listening to the sounds of nature around him. The rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig were normal, he thought, until he heard something that made him stop abruptly. A more intense sound, as if something was following his steps in the darkness, just a few meters away. He pointed his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. His heart raced, but he tried to convince himself it was just a small animal, maybe a deer or a rabbit. However, as he continued walking, the feeling of being watched only intensified. With every step, the sound seemed to get closer, even though he couldn't see anything beyond the shadows. Then, suddenly, he heard a loud snap, very close by. Marcos quickly turned the flashlight, and for a brief moment, he saw an indistinct figure among the trees. Tall, thin, and almost humanoid. His eyes widened, and a chill ran down his spine. When he blinked, the figure had vanished. Trying to stay calm, he hurried, quickening his pace. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, and the darkness around him seemed to close in even more. As he tried to push away the feeling of panic, he stopped once again, convinced he heard heavy breathing coming from the shadows. But when he shone the light on the area again, there was nothing. It was as if the forest itself was playing tricks on his mind. When he finally reached the end of the trail, Marcos ran to his car, not looking back. Upon arriving home, he tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps the darkness and isolation had messed with his senses. But to this day, he cannot forget that mysterious silhouette, and the feeling of being watched has never left him. Even though he still loves hiking, he has never hiked alone in the dark since that night. Story 2. The Disappearance in the Dark. It was a cold winter night when a group of 4 friends decided to venture down an isolated trail in the mountains. The idea seemed perfect to them. A night walk under the stars, away from the city and its constant noise. With light backpacks and flashlights in hand, they set off confidently, laughing and chatting. The forest was a mix of beauty and mystery, with tall trees and the ground covered in dry leaves that crackled under their feet. The walk was going smoothly until, at one point, one of the friends, Lucas, stepped away to take photos of a stretch of the trail. The group, engrossed in conversation, did not immediately realize he had fallen behind. When they noticed, they turned the flashlight in his direction, but Lucas had already vanished from sight. At first, they thought he had just wandered a bit and would soon rejoin them. They called out for him, but received no response. The laughter gave way to an uncomfortable silence. A sense that something was wrong began to settle in. They decided to retrace a few meters, shining their flashlights along the path in an attempt to locate Lucas. But time passed with no sign of him. Minutes of waiting turned into hours, and despair took hold of the group. They shouted his name, but all they heard in response was the echo of their own voices fading into the darkness. The forest, which had seemed peaceful before, now surrounded them with an oppressive presence, as if something was watching them from the shadows. Amidst the growing fear, one of them suggested it might be better to seek help, but the idea of leaving their friend alone in the dark felt even scarier. Just as they were about to head back to the trailhead, they heard footsteps. Relieved, they pointed their flashlights toward the sound, hoping to see Lucas. But what they found was something much more disturbing. He was standing between the trees with a vacant and confused expression, as if he had no idea where he was. When they asked where he had been, Lucas merely murmured that he got lost and couldn't find his way back. The strange thing was that, according to him, he had never been far from the trail. Even while hearing his friends' shouts, he swore that their voices seemed to come from all directions at once, as if he were being surrounded by something that prevented him from finding the right path. Lucas's story made no sense, and the frightened look on his face made it clear that there was something more in that place than they could understand. Without saying anything more, the group quickly decided to end the hike and head back to the car. The tension in the air was palpable. Whatever had happened that night, none of them wanted to question it further. But since then, none of them dared to hike that trail again after dark. Story 3. The Voice in the Darkness. Andre had always been a lover of night hikes. For him, there was nothing more relaxing than disconnecting from the world, feeling the silence of nature, and gazing at the starry sky. On one of his night adventures, he decided to explore a trail in a dense forest, famous for its winding paths and nearly untouched landscape. With his flashlight in hand and a good sense of direction, Andre wasn't worried. After all, he had hiked alone many times before. But that night, something felt different. The forest seemed quieter than usual. The typical sounds of animals and the wind rustling through the trees were absent. The only sound he could hear was the faint crackling of branches beneath his feet. Unbeknownst to him, he began to feel a slight anxiety, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. Ignoring the feeling, he pressed on until, at one point, the light from his flashlight began to flicker. Frustrated, he stopped to check the batteries, but they seemed to be in perfect condition. Then he heard it, a distant voice, weak, almost a whisper, calling his name. Andre. He stopped, perplexed. He looked around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from deep within the forest, a little ahead of him. Thinking it might be a lost hiker, he decided to follow the sound, curious and concerned at the same time. As he moved forward, the voice continued to call, growing ever closer, but never revealing its source. The trail, which had been clear before, now seemed to twist, leading Andre deeper into the forest. He began to feel a chill run down his spine. With each step, the calling grew clearer, but something was wrong. That voice, though familiar, sounded strange, as if it were not entirely human. Suddenly, the voice stopped. Silence returned to dominate the environment, but this time it was heavier, suffocating. Andre's flashlight began to flicker again, and he felt that he was lost, even though he knew the trail should be just a few meters away. Panic began to set in. He quickly turned around, trying to find his way back, but every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to move. That's when he heard the voice again, this time behind him, but much closer. Andre ran. Without thinking, he sprinted as fast as he could, not knowing where he was going. just wanting to escape. The sound of footsteps seemed to follow him, echoing through the darkness, and the call of his name grew more insistent. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spotted the clearing and the entrance to the trail. Without looking back, he raced to his car, trembling, and sped away from there. To this day, Andre cannot explain what happened that night. He has never returned to that forest, and the sound of that voice still haunts him, echoing in his memories. Whatever was calling his name, he is sure it was not human. Story 4, The Whisper of the Forest. Isabella was a landscape photography enthusiast who loved capturing the beauty of nature at dawn and dusk. One day, she decided that a night hike in a forest, known for its challenging trails, would be the perfect opportunity to capture unique images in the moonlight. With her camera in hand and a light backpack, she set off, eager to explore the forest under the moonlight. As she entered the trail, the atmosphere was calm, almost magical. Shadows danced with the movement of the trees, and the sound of the wind through the leaves created a soft melody. Isabella was immersed in the beauty around her, until the tranquility was interrupted by a whisper that seemed to float in the air. At first she thought it was the wind, but the words were distinct and intelligible. "Isabella, come." Surprised, she stopped and looked around. The sound seemed to come from a little further down the trail. Curious, she decided to follow the call, thinking it might be an illusion caused by her imagination. However, as she moved forward, the whisper intensified, repeating her name with a melodic and almost hypnotic tone. A sense of unease began to grow within her, but curiosity was stronger. The path seemed to narrow, and the forest grew denser. With each step, Isabella noticed that the environment around her changed. The shadows appeared deeper, and the trees seemed to lean in her direction. Finally, she reached a small clearing, illuminated by moonlight. In the center, there was a large stone covered in moss, and it was there that the whisper stopped. Isabella was breathless, but what shocked her was the vision before her. On the surface of the stone was a pattern of symbols that seemed to glow softly in the moonlight. Fascinated, she stepped closer to examine it, when suddenly the whisper returned, now louder and more insistent. "Isabella, it's your turn." Fear began to dominate her mind. She didn't know what was happening, but the voice seemed to beckon her toward something deep and dark. An invisible force seemed to pull her toward the stone, but in a sudden moment of clarity, she stepped back, turning to run down the trail. The whisper transformed into distant laughter, echoing as she moved away. Desperate, Isabella ran without looking back. When she finally reached the safety of her car, her heart was still pounding intensely. Whatever that voice was, she knew it was something beyond her understanding. Since that night, the forest, once a scene of beauty, became a constant reminder of what might be hidden in the darkness, and of what is better left untouched.